Rud. We used to work with Rud on integrity questions in the city hall of Lviv and and I think we know each other for many, many years, more than 15.
Okay, good. My family is from Lviv originally, so my parents left in 1941. So
that's wonderful. Okay.
41.
41, yeah, in 1941.
Just in the beginning of the war.
When the Germans came in, my father was in the leadership of the nationalist movement, and he was one of the 2 or 3 that didn't get arrested on June the 30th, when that was a declaration of the renewal of independence. So he managed to escape through the back window of his apartment and left. My mother followed shortly. So it was a whole history, and they spent the war running through villages and living periodically in one place, then another and another, and finally into Austria.
That's amazing. It's scary and fascinating story.
Yeah, yes, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, yes.
And it's good that he got away, because if he didn't do that, he would probably have been killed.
Probably. Well, they all ended up in concentration camps. So.
Okay, I just started our YouTube broadcast, and so I'm going to start now. Okay. And then we have this hour, so 8:30 we'll stop, 10:30, and 9 after the Jew. Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ruud Meij, and this is Don't Give Up Ukraine, episode 26. And we are glad to have with us Myron Spolsky, and we talk this episode on Canada, Plast, and the young ones, and I'm very glad to have Myron with us, because I think this is a very important subject, and we didn't discuss actually the youth and the kids yet in Don't Give Up Ukraine. So I think it's we are very glad to have you here, Myron.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Small word of you, Orissa.
Hello, everyone. This is me again, Orissa Bila, philosopher, also a professor of Ukrainian Catholic University from Lviv, Ukraine. And we start today our conversation with traditional question to our guest, Pan Myron. How was your week? Where are you right now located in regard to war? What your experiences?
Well, this week, like most of the weeks, I'm in Kyiv. I spent 2.5 months in Lviv when Kyiv was surrounded by the Russians. And it was actually quite funny, because one of my friends who was in the armed forces, I asked him, how can I help? He said, the best thing you can do is leave Kyiv so that we don't have to worry about you. So we did that about March the 1st or 2nd, and spent the time in Lviv, and then returned because my business reopened here, and it's always better to be near your employees at that point, especially at this time. And my week was like everybody else's, reading the news incessantly on what's happening and what's moving, what's not moving, speaking to friends that are in the armed forces and hearing where they are and what the situation is on various parts of the front. Somewhat anxious, because we don't know what's going to happen either from the Belarusian side or from Zaporizhia, for example. I think those issues are always of concern, and otherwise living our lives as normally as possible, enjoying the fact that there aren't a lot of cars in Kyiv, so we can get from home to work in about 20 minutes and not the usual hour, and living so on, but extremely busy now. So I won't leave work today till about 10:30 my time, and I hope to make it before the curfew time. So,
how was you have some friends of you at the front?
Several, yes. Yeah.
How are they doing?
How are they doing? It's tough. There are good days and there are difficult days for them. Those that are on the southern front are more enthusiastic, I would say, because there is some noticeable movement. They're not that concerned with the increases in Russian forces in the south. The ones in the east are in a difficult position. They are continually being fired at. And they're trying to stay in that line, sort of the Russians fire and our guys try to be here in relation to the line so they don't get hit. And they're trying to move forward or at least hold their line at that stage. So it's they're almost all members of Plast that are there. So in my own troop, we have almost 20 guys that are at the front, and there's a few women as well right at the front. So it's interesting to hear their perspectives and how things are organized and everything. So, but yeah, it's difficult. It's very emotional to speak to them. I can tell you that when you speak to them or communicate, it's an emotional period in the day.
Can imagine that. So, and then you lead some of these uplifting things like what's happened in Crimea. So that was quite a surprise for us all. I think last week when
yeah,
Ukrainians hit Crimea. I was very much enlightened by that. I think a lot of you were.
We laughed, we enjoyed it, I think. And was really happy with the hit on Jankoy because that destroyed a major intersection for the Russians, a very major intersection, and the one at Sakha was also an important hit, and hopefully that'll continue. We're hoping they start hitting the Belarusian sites.
Yeah. So let's go to our subject. But before that, could you give a short introduction of yourself?
Yes, I'm a Canadian. I was born in Canada. I was raised as a Canadian kid. So that meant that in the winters, I would be in shorts and sandals running around in the snow. Unlike immigrant kids that would be dressed in heavy clothing already in September. And I did my degree in political sciences in Toronto. I was always active in Plast. Because my father was active in Plast, my brother and my sister. While I was at university, I became active in Canadian politics and in Ukrainian politics, in the Ukrainian student movement and in the Canadian student movement. And I then moved to Winnipeg. I became the deputy executive director of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and then became executive director of the Ukrainian Cultural Center, which is the largest Ukrainian museum outside of Ukraine. And then went off to run something called the Ukrainian Community Development Committee, which was the group responsible for introducing bilingual school programs in the public school system of Manitoba, which is the province, and also the neighboring provinces. And then we also moved from there into developing a vision and strategic planning document for the Ukrainian community, which shifted the focus of our activities from internal community politics to external politics and to general cultural traditions. It was a statement that Ukrainians are one of the founding groups within Canada. We belong there. We have nowhere to go. And if you remember, there was no real Ukraine at that point. And hence we have a particular position in Canadian society. And one of those issues was that we need to have political representation at every level of government, starting from school boards to city councils, to provincial governments, and the federal government. And we worked on that. And then of course, independence came along. I took a break from politics and came here for what was going to be a year, and 34 years later, I'm still here and in business. Complete shift of issues, but the political side of me also always And the community side of me always pulls me back into the community.
And now you're also the president of, how should I say it, the CEO of the executive committee of Plast.
Yes, of the International Federation of Plast. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, so, out of curiosity, before we change to our Canada subject, well, you're something. Why? It's maybe a stupid question, but why did you get back to Ukraine?
I didn't come back to Ukraine. I'm an immigrant here. So I had to Ukrainianize when I came here.
Oh.
I arrived here in 1988 in order to facilitate the organization of a series of concerts in Canada dedicated to the Millennium of Christianity of Ukraine. And for the first time, a major Canadian symphony orchestra played the works of contemporary Ukrainian composers, Stankovich, Skoda, Kiva, Letushinsky, and others. And we had a series of concerts. They became extremely popular. I was then on the board of directors of the Winnipeg Symphony, which is one of the major symphonies in North America. And we continued working that way and organizing new music festivals, inviting Ukrainian composers to participate. But I was also getting integrated. And when I arrived here, my first impression in Moscow of how does this society, Soviet society, survive when you have senior military officers walking around drunk at night or even in the daytime. That was my first sort of impression. How do people survive if they can't buy food regularly and there's lineups for everything? What are these cars doing? What are these apartments? You know, all those aspects of Soviet society that we had. And the corruption of Soviet society this is the corruption we have today is not a new phenomenon. It's a holdback of the Russian Empire and of Soviet society. And I had this feeling that it would collapse any moment because you couldn't continue operating a bankrupt society, a financially bankrupt society. It had nothing to do with nationalities policy or anything. It was a simple economic issue that was happening, around which then a nationalities issue developed as a contemporary mainstream issue rather than a marginal or peripheral issue. And I stayed, you know, I married, divorced, went through all those normal stages of life here. And so this is my country now. And that's why I didn't leave during the war, because I would be an immigrant somewhere else again.
Nice, my country now. Yeah,
it's my country. Yes, completely. I went through all the Maidans and all the major demonstrations in one way or another. So I can tell you, I was ready to leave when Yanukovych became president. About 2 years into his term, because it became impossible to function here completely.
Yep.
So,
thank you. So let's switch to, we agreed to start to discuss about the diaspora in Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons we wanted to discuss several diasporas, so we're going to discuss the Dutch diaspora next time if everything is okay, goes okay, is that there is a huge diaspora. It's already also for more than 100 years going on and so on. And Aris and I thought, well, the diaspora that should be and probably is a major force in the war what's now going on. And so we phrase that as like opening the third front, in the sense that the civic front, Ukrainian front of citizens who support Ukrainian struggle at home, but also as a core to, let's say, international solidarity, put pressure on our governments and so on. And then we decided, well, we want to explore a bit with people who are well acquainted with the diaspora, how they feel about that and how they see that. And that's also a bit like thinking about what are the peculiarities of the different diasporas. The Dutch diaspora is quite new, quite different from Canada. You probably know better than I. So in that sense, we are quite curious about how you see the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. What about its traditions and strengths and developments and so on? Could you share something about that with us?
Well, you know, the Ukrainian community in Canada is probably a unique community in terms of the Ukrainian diasporas around the world. It came to Canada under different terms. It arrived as a result of an agreement between two Ukrainians and the Minister of the Interior at that time. And among those the terms of the agreement was the right to use the Ukrainian language in the school system as a language of instruction. So that you had one facet of maintenance, community maintenance and cultural maintenance. They tended to settle in fairly condensed regions of the country in Western Canada. They were settled there for a number of reasons, one of which was to prevent Americans from coming in and taking over those lands. And the other one was a hidden reason that emerged in the memoirs of that Minister of the Interior, was that he really didn't like the French, and he didn't want the French moving from Quebec into those areas and bringing Catholicism with them, only to find out that most of the Ukrainians moving there were Catholics. But as a result of the school system, you had the development of the first middle class or intellectual class of Ukrainians in Canada, and who were the teachers, who became school inspectors, school principals, became active in the school systems as school trustees, and eventually moved into public office. You also have the maintenance of the language as a force that bound the community together. They were regionally condensed, so that still in the 1980s, you had small towns in Western Canada where you could hear Ukrainian spoken as a popular language. It was, of course, an old Ukrainian. And certainly in major cities, there were complete regions of the city where you could speak Ukrainian quite freely in a store and whatever, and somebody would respond to you in Ukrainian. If that's what your choice was. So it's a unique community that way. You had in the 1905, the first calling of a Ukrainian National Congress, which didn't occur anywhere else in any other diaspora that early. That dissipated over time. It didn't last very long. But you had very quickly an external political force emerging, with Ukrainians running for the Canadian Parliament, for provincial parliaments, for city councils, taking offices as mayors and so on, and influencing Canadian politics. Despite all the discrimination and the political nativism that emerged during World War I, the internment camps, that strength held. You had also in the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada a melding of the various waves of immigrants. The first wave pre-World War I, the second melded into the first, and the third melded into the previous two, because the first two created, for example, English language courses for the new immigrants, for their own immigrants. The churches were there, the community centers were there, and were going to expand. So you had a much greater sense of unity between all of the waves than you would have, for example, in the US. As a result of the role of the church, you also didn't have the breakup of the community into minor ethnic groups. There was no Lemko, there was no Rusin church. That formed after World War II, but it was part of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, for example. But there's definitely no Lemko community as such. It melded into the Ukrainian community. And they functioned as a small ethnic group within the Ukrainian community. So those were the key issues. And then we had the movement of the young intellectuals, those that are about 10 years older than I, that are now about 80 years old, who became fully involved in the community at universities and whatever, and started influencing the community into new directions, liberalizing the community, democratizing the community, and moving it along. And that, of course, has helped. So we've had the phenomenon now that we see of the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada being of Ukrainian origin and speaking Ukrainian, and her children speaking Ukrainian, all those phenomena that we see. But we see a greater phenomenon, which is that wherever you go in Canada, you will see something Ukrainian. You go to your local supermarket, you can buy Ukrainian food that's produced, mass produced, and you can buy it. You go to a Canada Day celebration, national government, provincial government, you always have something Ukrainian. You go to the ballet or the symphony, you will see something Ukrainian at some point during the season. So it's not burdensome to be Ukrainian. That's good, and that's also has some negative effects, but those are the issues that we have, which allows then the community now in this crisis point to respond as a total community. So for example, I have nephews and nieces that are far removed from the community. They don't speak Ukrainian, they don't have Ukrainian names, there's nothing to identify them as Ukrainians. And suddenly they've come to life on this issue, going out to demonstrations and that. And I see that, I hear that from all my friends that, wow, you know, my third cousins emerged out of the blue and have come to demonstrations, or are helping in humanitarian centers, or are doing whatever. And that's part of that phenomenon. It's not all rosy and not all cheeky as that, but I think that's a phenomenon, and the community Canada needs to ensure that it continues developing and has a reconsideration at some point of where it's headed and how it needs to respond, because there are some divisions now between the last two waves, the post-1991 waves, and the older community. There's sort of a different understanding of where things go. But I think those are the factors that we have in those communities. There, and I can go on and on speaking about the details, but that gives us that community, general political influence at all levels of government, and influence at the local levels, and influence on the popular side. Now, there's also been a negative to that, which is that after 1991, the rate of linguistic assimilation of the Ukrainian community in Canada has been horrendous. We're down to less than 5% of Ukrainian Canadians who know Ukrainian. So those bilingual school programs in the West are a lifeline for the Ukrainian language in Canada. And that, by the way, is where the Vice Prime Minister of Canada learned to speak Ukrainian, really beyond her own family, was in the school system.
Let me ask you this. We didn't plan to ask you this question, but I think it's important, since we are talking now a lot about language in Ukraine, about this bilingual problem in Ukraine, the Russian Ukrainian. Do you think really language is important to the community self-identification? Or maybe there is something more than language? How would you, I mean, this is really language meaningful in the process of self-identification?
Yes and no. It's perhaps of less importance in the diaspora, because it's difficult to maintain a language, a usable language that you speak continually on all subjects. My Ukrainian was a kitchen Ukrainian until I moved here. I had a difficult time functioning here for about 2 years in Ukrainian. I mean, my automatic response when I hear somebody speaking English is to move automatically to English, even though the other person may know Ukrainian. And I think that is Ukrainian important to them? I think it's the sort of the icing on the cake that gives them a completeness to their identification, their ability to read Ukrainian literature, contemporary Ukrainian literature, which they don't know very well. They have to wait for translations of Zhadan or Kurkov or whoever it is. And they certainly wouldn't understand, for example, Podderevyansky and his humor, because that language is so different from the language that we learned. But I think it has some role. But in Ukraine, language is critical. It is part of the decolonization process. It's part of the identification process. And it's very much like the process that we went through in Quebec, where the elites, the French-Canadian elites, stopped speaking French, moved to English. Their children all had English first names and not French first names. And in order to survive as a society, they had to insert very strong laws protecting the French language, forcing people to speak French and French only. I mean, the entire school system went into French. The moment a child hit the schoolyard, he or she had to speak French and not English. Everything in the school system was French. They had an hour of English a day, and that was it. Now with the internet, they're starting to see losses again in language, and they're forcing the issue again. And I think here, unfortunately, for probably about 2 generations, those kinds of laws will need to emerge to ensure that the language that is spoken on the streets amongst children initially is Ukrainian, that they have a second language which is not Russian but English, or French or German, whatever it is. And it's not very democratic, but that's the only way we're going to survive and go through a major process of decolonization in this country.
Thank you. Well, I agree with you. And I also think that as long as our citizens can speak any language at home, but we have to understand that Russian in a public discourse is used as the language of colonization, and as far as, and that is something that we just really cannot take for granted.
Very much. And you know, sometimes I wonder, for example, should Nekrasov be banned or not? Was he anti-Ukrainian? My first apartment here was on Nekrasivska Vulitsa. I read his works. I didn't find him to be anti-Ukrainian. I found Bulgakov to be anti-Ukrainian and all those things. But I localized here by watching Bulgakov's films, The Master and Margarita, and you know, the rest of the film, the Soviet classics. That's how I learned to understand Soviet society. But I think, unfortunately or fortunately, we need to get rid of all of that and start with our own heroes. We ultimately have at least 300 years of a modern civilization that's developed. We can go back to Skovorodak, Kotlяревski, and move forward and politically go through all the processes, which were no different and didn't occur any later than they occurred in Europe, including the period of integral nationalism. And I'm not a fan of integral nationalism and the focus on it, because I think it's in the entire world, all the nativism and the integral nationalism should be left as a historical phenomenon, not be repeated. But nevertheless, it's a phenomenon. It occurred all around the world. It occurred in Canada. It occurred in the United States, Germany, of course, France, and other countries. And we have to live with that. But we have a long, lengthy history of political, ideological development, philosophical development, musical development, which we're just starting to learn about and to appreciate.
So how did you, because you have a long history of Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, and how did Ukrainians see their homeland in these period? I think this will change. This has changed in some time, but it is also, as my experience, I have some relatives, Dutch relatives in Canada, and a Dutch diaspora, if there is something like that, is also like a sort of container of something what they think is a kind of Dutch nationality, identity, so to say. It's not totally true, but that's how it works. And then the diaspora gives something back to the homeland, so to say. And so how was that in Canada? How did Ukrainians see their homeland? Did they see it as the homeland, or something like, okay, I'm now in Canada, I'm a Canadian, and of course I have my Ukrainian roots, but Ukraine is somewhere I came from, but homeland is a bit much more to ask, I would say.
Our parents saw Ukraine as their homeland, and I think they had a hope to see it again. My father never lived to see it. My mother did return a couple of times, and then she understood that it wasn't her home anymore. And I think most Ukrainian Canadians who had roots here, who were born here and lived here for some time, in returning didn't, when they came here, they understood it was no longer their country. So independence for Ukrainian Canadians in some ways was the worst thing that happened for the Ukrainian Canadian community, because it started to assimilate. It developed somewhat of a negative image about Ukraine, its corruption, including within their own families. So it went from a personal level to a general level. Some of them tried to start businesses without really thinking. They thought with their hearts and not their calculators, and they went through all those processes here. So I think the Dutch community sort of, I know some of the Dutch community in Canada, and it has some of that there without the corruption element, of course. But there is a link there somehow. Well, I'm of Dutch origin, or my father was of Dutch, or my grandfather, or whatever. But I think in many respects, because the Ukrainians in Canada were so rooted in the development of the country, there's a different sense. We learned our Ukrainian culture as a Canadian culture and not as a foreign culture.
Yeah, I think that's important. I don't know but why, but I think it's important. So let's last question about the Canadian diaspora is about what's actually happening now in the diaspora when it comes to the war. So one of the things we are exploring a bit is there a kind of, let's say, Canadian strategy of the diaspora when it comes to their role in the war, in defeating Putin and supporting Ukraine? Is there some, let's say, some collective strategy developing in Canada? What would you say about that?
There is very much a collective strategy. Part of it rests in the older tradition of political influence and the ability of the Ukrainian Canadian community's leadership to influence decisions being made by the Canadian government to some extent. Dealing with the competing interests or views of others within the political system. For example, the very active Asian community, which has somewhat different views of the events occurring in Ukraine and in Russia. So that's been a competing interest there, but I think they're doing reasonably well in the conditions that, let's say, the Canadian Armed Forces are not the best equipped in the world. We have to recognize that. So when Canada gives Ukraine 4 tanks, that's a lot of tanks coming from Canada, because we only probably have 20 tanks in the entire Canadian Army. Yeah. Our planes are very old. Our ships usually don't make it to where they're supposed to go. So that's a joke, but it's but I think at that level, yeah. I mean, who wants to invade Canada anyways? The land of polar bears and snow. We have 6 months of snow and 6 months of road repairs. That's basically our life. But I think on the community side, the humanitarian side, the community has picked up the ability to pull out people for demonstrations and continue doing that regularly at every needed point in large numbers. The ability to mobilize the community to contact their members of parliament at all levels, so the federal and the provincial levels, and those are key to influence the decisions that are being made, to influence, let's say, the refugee program that Canada opened. That refugee program, by the way, is very broad. We have people arriving as refugees that have lived in Europe or in China for 10 years. They're really not refugees, but it fits the Canadian policy of renewing the refugee programs and integrating those into both Canadian society and the Ukrainian community. Raising money for Ukraine. I don't have exact figures, but they're quite significant. They're in the tens of millions, the mid tens of millions that have been raised, that are being shipped here quietly to assist the humanitarian process in Poland, for example, Slovakia, Germany, to assist in the refugee centers here within Ukraine, and considerations of various projects here. And we want to talk about kids. getting kids to become involved. So kids involved in putting together individual first aid kits, all those kinds of things that they get involved with, and they have develop an understanding what they're doing it for, both from a side of philosophically supporting democracy to supporting their parents' homeland or their grandparents' homeland. Those are all issues that are important and critical.
Is there a sorry, Orisa, go ahead.
Yeah, let's go to kids and to youth, because I think one of the most important things that that people actually have in this life is the people that will continue their lives, right? Their expectations, or maybe their aspirations. And you are head of one of the biggest Ukrainian youth organizations. I think maybe the biggest, right? It was established 110 years ago, in 1911. And I think, it survived only because of diaspora. Because if, considering what happened to Ukrainians in Ukraine, if there were no diaspora, I think this organization had to die. It was suppressed by the Soviet ideology. It could not exist in the form. And probably for people who do not know what Plast is, we have to explain that one of the key messages, the major hustles, the major
slogans. I don't want to call it slogan, but it's slogan.
The God and Ukraine.
Yes.
So, and I think this is a scout organization, but I think it's not really about scouting. It's really about values. Could you tell us a few words about this? How how I remember Plast. When I was growing up in after the Soviet Union fell apart, I think scouting, the Plast was the organization for all the kids of my age. I was 15, 13 then, and I remember that it was a big deal for us to be in Plast. We were extremely proud, and I think for people of that age to have role models, and actually Plast was built around these Ukrainian heroes, the idea of the values that we have to cherish and to develop and kind of like to support as Ukrainians. And now I think when in this wartime, it becomes really important again. It's really like an idea that never stops. So could you share your observations about role of the Plast at this very moment, and also about role of Plast in this, specifically in relation to these values and use?
Well, you're right, and I won't go through the entire history of Plast. I think my role growing up in Plast in Canada, simply because my whole family was involved in Plast, that was an essential. No matter what else we did, my father was in Canadian politics. My mother did humanitarian work, but we were always in Plast. And we always, every week we had to attend meetings and go through everything. It's a scouting organization. It continues to work in the traditions of Baden-Powell, who founded the scouting movement. It's somewhat conservative for some, for me included. It's a bit too conservative, but I tolerate that and I push it a little bit more. But it's an important structure in the diaspora, and it's an important structure here. In the diaspora, it was important because Plast was sort of the hub, the center, where people of various political views and various religious views could come together, come to an agreement on issues, and then proceed with the process of developing the community. And that was, again, one of the features in Canadian society, was that the big push for the democratization and modernization of the Ukrainian Canadian community came from people around Plast. And there was a significant group, and it worked for a long time to produce that. It was also the group that encouraged its younger members to go into Canadian politics and become active, no matter which party. So it didn't matter if you were conservative, liberal, or social democrat. And my entire generation went left, just so you understand. So, and nobody threw us out of the community, which was unusual for any Ukrainian community. In fact, to the contrary, we had support from the community to proceed in our lines, with the understanding, of course, they had to give back to the community when it was called for. I think that's critical here in it. Let me go in Europe, in the diaspora, in the world. And at this stage, our membership is very heavily involved in this entire process, in the entire process of raising money, developing first aid kits, political involvement, organizing those benefit concerts in various cities in Europe. All those issues are what we're involved in. Setting up the humanitarian centers on the Polish-Ukrainian border, Slovak, etc. Finding places to live, establishing schools for the refugee kids, teaching those arriving some Polish or Slovak or German, whatever it took, because not all the countries were prepared for this influx. So they had immediate reception. So we know that we have a large community that's active and moving and helping from within Plast. In Ukraine, Plast, which started here slowly in 1988 and 1989, became sort of the point at which you can say we formalized and started functioning. It also has changed rapidly from where it was 30 odd years ago to today. If then it was a collection of small people who happened to speak Ukrainian and were extremely patriotic, in sociological terms, they may have been even marginal or peripheral to their own societies because of their positions on Ukrainian issues. Some people may not like hearing that, but that's what it was. I found that marginality to be disturbing at times. And today it's not. It's a central part of Ukrainian society and it's growing rapidly. We were growing at over 10% a year in terms of membership in Ukraine. And this was not paper membership. These are actual children that were participating every week in activities in various centers. And we were growing very rapidly in the east and the south of Ukraine. Just so there's an idea of one of our largest centers was in Kharkiv. We had a very large center.
What I was interested, how is now Plast in I mean, we were talking about this colonization that Ukraine was a victim of for a few centuries. And I think Plast could play here a key role in actually decolonizing Ukraine. So do you see this change, and how you as a head of Plast organization, how do you see how is Plast influencing these processes of decolonization?
Well, I mean, basically because you have people who are interested in things Ukrainian and not things Soviet. They all speak Ukrainian as their primary language. They enjoy things that are Ukrainian rather than Soviet. And so at the base level, it's Ukrainian, and that moves up into business, that moves into politics, and general social issues. And it's a transformation in society. So when we go to Cave Mohyla Academy, when we go to the Ukrainian Catholic University, you will find a higher than normal representation of members of Plast in those educational centers. When I look at Mohyla, which I know better, I see a lot of people, members of Plast there at various levels, both in the professorial groups and in the student groups. So they have changed as a result of the educational institutions in which they were, and they also changed those institutions because of where they're coming from and where they are active in. So we see Maidans, and where did the students come from? They came from Mohyla, and they came from Catholic University. And they were the backbone, the student backbone that moved society. And they are the backbone that is moving Ukrainian society. So that's Plast in a public way. The number of members of Ukrainian parliament that are members of Plast that are continue to be active, those that are in various positions, senior positions in government, be that at the national level or at the regional levels. Because Plast is so large here, I don't know most of its members. When I go to meetings on various issues into the regions, people say, "Oh, I'm in Plast, by the way." You know, and I think it was at some point under Poroshenko. You know, we greet ourselves with our left hands. That's our greeting. And so we, so at one point there was a meeting of senior members of parliament. And everybody who's greeting themselves with their left hands, and the speaker of the time, Parobi, said, "Now, tell me who here is not a member of Plast," you know, and it turned out to be the smaller number. So I think we'll start seeing, as more and more members of Plast go into political, higher political levels, transformation, and those, I don't want to call them ideologies, but those instincts that we learn in Plast that we bring to our kids are brought into general society. You know, don't steal, be friendly, be democratic, you know, support your country. Those are important. You know, Ukrainian society is secularizing, probably at a more rapid rate than, let's say, Polish society. So we will confront the issue of God in the next 20 years, probably, because of the rate of secularization. But we're seeing a very strong sense of spiritual development, which is not tied to something up there, but something that is very daily, and that's starting to influence the way society looks. And as everybody is saying, of course, you know, these last 6 months have turned Ukrainian society completely around. I see it in my business, starting from the fact that people that on February 23rd spoke Russian in our business meetings now speak Ukrainian. However that Ukrainian may be, but it's Ukrainian. They make an effort. I see them, if before they said, well, let's try Russian product. Now it's like never again. Don't even bother asking me about that stuff. You know, Kazakh product, no, it's no better than Russian. So Uzbek, we'll think about Uzbek. Okay, so there's a distinction, and people are becoming politically aware, and I think that's critical. And I think that Plast has played a very important role in that. It's important for people to know that we're not fascists. We have people that are enthusiastically patriotic. I'll call it that way. We have, as you would have in any society, people that are on the extreme right. But we have a very good cross section from left to right of people that are democratically inclined and ready to proceed. And those political ideologies within Ukrainian society will form over time. And it will come out of centers like Plast, Mohila, and the Catholic University. And I think that's where the key role of Plast is, that it slowly is transforming society. I can tell you that the kind of people that are sending their kids to Plast these days in Kyiv would surprise a lot of people, because we're getting children of the oligarchs coming in. And we're in the troop that I help, kids between 11 and 18. We've got 4 of them, which is you know, something that we wouldn't expect. They're Ukrainian speaking as opposed to their parents, who are usually Russian speaking. So that will draw in an entirely new group of people into there. And we're seeing the regular kind of middle class that's coming in, intellectual or better read, if we want to say, who are coming in. And those kids come out and they continue to maintain, even when they leave, they continue to maintain an allegiance to the organization of some form. So now when we say we need to raise money, we're seeing a lot of those that used to be members of Plast contributing. Or we say we need to deliver a car to the front. And we're seeing both current and former members of Plast responding and coming in. I think that's a very important role that we play.
Yep.
And we're teaching kids that it's fun to be Ukrainian, and that's very important. That it's, it's very important. I look at Canadian society and I ask myself, why are people patriotic about being Canadians? And Canadians are extremely patriotic, I can assure you that. Well, we have a great sense of humor. We have polar bears, we have maple syrup, we have beavers. That's our national animal. So, lots of snow and great hockey, but people are patriotic because that's how the school system works. It doesn't force you to be patriotic. It simply teaches you that we're a great country. We have a wonderful countryside. And I think that's part of what we teach in Plast. We have wonderful mountains, we have great rivers, unique culture, a very unique culture that has so many origins in it, from the Trakic cultures, from the Persian, the Greek, all influencing how we look and how we came from. And that's what we try to show in Plast, what we are.
Interesting. So if you look at what Orissa said, well, it's like a transformation in the sense of decolonization. I was very surprised of the oligarchic kids, because it's also a force in the oligarchization. So, and that's immensely important, I would say, for Ukraine. So what to do with your capital, so not to say. So, and if you, I'm not talking about Plast and explaining what you're doing. That's basically what you're doing is educating. I'm not sure if this is the right word, enjoying and so on. Good citizens, good Ukrainian citizens, so to say, who have a bit of fun in their life, and who can be civilized against each other. So in that sense, that's my idea what I got. So let's do
exactly. That's what it is. It's being good citizens of your own country.
Yeah, that's and this patriotic thing, I like that very much. So I'm from Holland, so patriotism is always a bit suspect here. So we have only patriots when it comes to football. So that's basically what it is, and the rest, well, okay. And that leaves basically the patriotism to the far right. And that's a pity, because then you don't see what the importance of your nation could be for yourself in a force in the world, and a civilizing force. So that's always what I'm thinking, and talking to you and colleagues of you and other people. Like you are now giving something back to the world. So, and that's very interesting as a model. So when I first heard about Plast, to be very honest, I would say, well, okay, I'm born in 54, so I'm 67 now, and when I was about 15, 16, we had also scouts and we call it goblins, I think I would say, kabouters and so on. And I then thought, okay, that's a bit old-fashioned. So that was my first impression. It's something from the society of yesterday. But if you are talking about this now, that didn't give me totally not the impression that it's something of the society of yesterday, but the society of today. So let me, one question. So you are the CEO of Plast International. So being enthusiastic of Plast is one thing, but the other thing is becoming CEO of Plast International. So why did you want to become CEO of Plast International? Because it's a very important position, and it gives you a kind of responsibility from two sides. From the heritage, so you get something what you have to take care of, but you also have to think about tomorrow. What will Plast for the next generation be? Because it's about kids. So why becoming a president or a CEO?
I didn't want to be president.
You are left.
I honestly didn't want to be president. My stepdaughter, I had to sign my stepdaughter into Plast. And the guy that I went to say, where should I go? He said, well, you're going to go there with her, and then you're going to come back to me because I have work for you to do. And that was in about 2004, 2005. And so I started doing a little bit, and then I laid off, but then he kept pulling me back. And my senior troop, when we were 18, we select a troop by our interests. So I went to a troop that specializes in mountain climbing. Anything dealing with mountains is our field. And it also is sort of a group where you find a lot of academics, historians. Subtelny was in our group, Danilo Struk, the literary historian, editor of the Ukrainian Encyclopedia, people like that. So, but it was also a group known for its rowdiness. We were not the calmest people around. If you had any Plast gathering, the loudest people that were drinking beer was us always. So very not Plast behavior. We certainly had no problems with alcohol and cigarettes, or cigars for that matter. But nevertheless, and those guys started calling me back. Come on, let's, we need you, whatever. And then I had to organize, there was an international conference of Plast here in Kyiv in 2016. They asked me to be the organizing chair, and I organized it and ended up in the international executive. And time came to make a transition from the leadership to a new generation, to a new way of thinking. And I was basically pushed into the position with a lot of opposition from the traditionals, I can tell you.
Oh, that's interesting. So
it was actually an ugly fight, I can tell you.
It was also about the direction Plast should take in the future, that you were elected. So
yeah, very much a change in liberalization, refocusing to make Ukraine the international base of Plast. Those kinds of things, and changing the traditions that we follow. And of course, the older the organization, the more difficult it is to make changes.
Of course, yeah. So you have to be careful about it, because there's a lot invested in Plast by the old generation, so to say. Yeah.
It is. That's always an issue. Yes.
So how do you see what is your mission as a CEO of Plast International? If you may draw a map of the Plast for the next generation, how would it look like?
What I planned 3.5 years ago and what's happening now are two very different things. I mean, within 3 months we had COVID, and that threw all our plans out the window, and then the war started. Basically, we were to start a thorough review of our vision, our strategies, our aims, our goals, from top to bottom. Looking at religious issues, for example, we have a large Muslim community in Ukraine. Where do they fit in Plast? Because Plast charters speak about Christianity. I just threw that out as an issue. We have people who are agnostic. That means neither here nor there, neither believing in God nor being atheist. Where do they fit? I won't even raise the atheism issue at this stage, because I think that's too early for Plast to consider everywhere in the world, except for perhaps Canada, which, by the way, has the most liberal Plast of all. We need to focus on Ukraine on one hand, on the other hand, in developing Plast internationally in all the centers. Ukrainians are living in China, in Japan, in various countries, and we need to start focusing on developing groups there, expanding what we have or developing from scratch. We need to modernize our educational systems and our philosophies at times and at points, and all those issues we are going to look at and refocus. But it's very much a modernization process that we have to go through that has not occurred for the last 70 years, really.
Mm-hmm.
So the last major changes occurred in the mid-1950s, about the years when you and I were born. I was born a couple of years earlier than you. So I think we need to change those views. We're not accounting for the new political views of our membership here internationally. We still tend to the conservative and we forget about the rest. I think those kinds of issues we have to look at. We have to look at, well, the educational programs. We barely had telephones in those days, and now we're talking about kids being wired completely, and being pumped with information incessantly. How do we intervene in that informational roadway to ensure that they get the right message at the right time? How do we ensure that they don't get beaten off the track by the Russians, let's say, who are on YouTube and everywhere, and sending in messages that are not necessarily the correct messages? I think those are the issues that we need to look at here. So it won't be a short revisitation. It will be a rather difficult and complex process. And we need to find a balance. And that's also the most important thing, is to always ensure that, since we're not a political organization, we're a community-based organization, that we find a balance between everybody's views. And I don't care what my views are in that case. I try to ensure that I know what the decision is going to be before we start the discussion of the decision. The process. I think it's a highly political and politic way of approaching issues, but it's the only way you can do it in this kind of structure, almost like a church. It's
I was thinking when I was listening to you in the last part, and I know Orissa very long, for a very long time, and I know that the discussion in Yuko are in a certain level sense going in the same way. So discussion about the future of youth, the future of our civilization is a bit too big to say that, but the future of our nation, the future of our values, and so on. Is there some connection between you, Orissa, and not you personally, but Yuko and Plast, for instance, in that?
Oh, sure. Yes, I think this is what already Myron said about these values that are in the core. And I think, well, just to mention, Lubomir Huzer, the former head of Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, was a Plastun, was in Plast organization. Metropolitan Boris Gudyak, who was one of the founders of UKU, was Plast member. And every time we have some big events, he always mentioned this. He's saying it's one of the key points that were decisive for his upbringing, for his values, for his education, beside the family. Because I think what really is about these youth organizations, and that's in the Soviet Union, we had the huge youth organization, what called pioneers. Which is not proper translation, right? But pioneer is something different in English, but it's like pionere was this huge ideological ground for youth to be educated, to be brought up in a certain spirit of the country, of the state. But Plast, I think, goes more than state. Plast actually started something like state-oriented, but what I see, what happens really is Plast becoming a community-oriented, and that's what really modern Ukraine is about. We kind of we transcended this already, the consciousness of the not nation, but the ethnic-oriented state, right? We become more like a community. What I see, what Myron mentioned here, is that including Muslims, because the Muslims are part of Ukrainian community, right? You can be Muslim Ukrainian. That's not a contradiction. And what I see around myself right now in the war, I think in the last few months, I have a number of friends actually approaching me. I don't know for what reason they think that I can help them, but they're approaching me. Can you help me for my kid to find a place in Plast? And like,
nope, line up.
I mean, I thought sometimes 10 years ago that Plast is over because we have independent country, we are good, we all set. And now I see what's happening really is everybody wants their kids to be in the Plast.
Yes.
Well, in Lviv, you have a 3-year lineup to get your kids into Plast.
3 years.
3 years, unless you sign them up at 2 and they go into this preschool program. But even there, I think there's a lineup now. In Kyiv, it's about a 2-year lineup. In Kharkiv, before the war started, is about 1 year. You have to wait. So you imagine the pressure. But yes, it's there are some in Plast that want Plast to become intertwined with government, but there are most of us that don't want Plast to become intertwined with government. And it doesn't matter which government. We're talking about a highly democratic Dutch or Canadian government, or Danish or Ukrainian, which is still learning to be democratic. You have to stay free of those influences. You can accept money, but it can only be part of the money that you need to operate with.
So last question, because we're already about a bit late, so to say, but there are a lot of refugees now, Ukrainian refugees going worldwide, and only in the Netherlands, I know we have 68,000 refugees, most of them women and children, coming to the Netherlands, and I think they I can imagine, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure they need a Plast, so to say. So are you doing something in that direction? So
yes,
I know, yes, because I think this is very important for them.
We have, in virtually every European country, we have members of Plast that have evacuated to those countries. So where we didn't have an existing organization like Poland or Austria or Germany or France, we have them moving in, and they're organizing. The biggest problem is with training counselors. We don't have enough counselors that will train, that will lead the groups, or training parents to become counselors. In the UK, for example, that has been very good, because we've seen parents from here who sent their kids sort of, okay, kids, Saturday, go to Plast, that kind of routine, now becoming involved in the UK and joining Plast already as adults. And I think that will happen. In the Netherlands, by the way, the former head of Plast Ukraine has just moved there. So, and she is going to become very active. She's an exceptionally good organizer. So she will help Christina in pursuing, and of course, Christina is the head of the European Coordinating Council of Plast, which is now 15 or 16 organizations that are coordinating and developing. We went online 3 years ago when COVID started with all our training programs, and they were highly successful. And we started redoing them now. And of course, now with the war, we're going full blast with them. Virtually, we're going to have we're hiring professional staff now to prepare, moving from a volunteer status to professional staff to prepare those training programs. So they go from the beginning of, teaching people what is Plast to how do we run meetings, an annual program for kids age 6, for example, and age 7, and so on. It's an entire process that we're going through now. So it's a major effort in changing things as they go.
And it's also that these unintended consequences, because if I fantasize a bit of that, I really can imagine that Dutch children want to become member of Plast. So,
they do.
Yeah. So
we have a list of kids waiting now there.
I'm already saying something, what's already happening, so to say. So it's not a fantasy. Okay.
That's right.
Good.
So you'll see it. But for example, in France, for the longest, we started there 4 years ago, and we were hovering around 100 members, and suddenly we have 400 members. More than half are Ukrainians that have lived in France for several years, and have suddenly the Ukrainian in them has clicked and said, "Oh, I got to get my kid into Plast," right? And the rest are the refugees, and that will increase. Poland, of course, has gone from 200 kids to almost 2,000 children.
So, but imagine that Dutch kids also want to say, "I want to be in Plast, Mama." So
yeah.
That would be quite interesting to have.
And that will happen. You, of course, have the distinction of having the only Ukrainian choir which didn't have any Ukrainians in it. You know that.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, with a special country.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, Myron, for being here. I think it was very informative and very pleasant. I learned a lot about Plast and about the Canadian diaspora, of the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. Thank you very much for sharing with us. And as I say to everyone, I hope to see you back somewhere, somehow, and maybe in some better times than now. And I have the feeling that I will. Thank you very much.
And I thank you for this evening. And I hope to see you in Kyiv.
That I hope certainly too. Yes.
Soon.
Soon.
Yes.